Hello. First, I'd like to welcome you, colleagues and students, and thank you for attending my talk this evening, which is part of the evening lecture series by Fokum. My name is Natasha Degen, and I'm the chair of Art Market Studies at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, which is part of the State University of New York. I'd also like to thank TU for extending this kind invitation to speak with you tonight. My lecture is titled Between Crisis and Contingency, the Art Market Today and its Post-Pandemic Future. And I'll be focusing specifically on the current situation in the United States, which is defined by two unique challenges. The first, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic. The US has been particularly hard hit, with over 13.7 million total cases, and cases continue to rise. Moreover, the US is experiencing a political changeover. Last month, in November 2020, President Donald Trump was defeated by Joe Biden, who received over 7 million more votes. This presentation will examine the effect of both of these circumstances on arts institutions. In terms of the pandemic, the federal government has offered little in terms of leadership, and so cases continue to rise. This presents a profound challenge to museums, galleries, and other kinds of arts organizations and businesses. But at the same time, the pandemic has contributed to wealth inequality, which of course is correlated with art market performance. In fact, during the first 6 months of the pandemic, wealth of American billionaires grew by over $845 billion. At the same time, the political changeover points to the possibility of policy changes on the horizon. So we'll look at these first, and particularly dive a little deeper into this political moment. So to provide an overview of the content that we'll be covering in this first part of the lecture, I'd like to go over our agenda. First, we'll be looking at Trump's policies and their effect on both public arts funding in museums, as well as the market. We'll also look at how Trumpism has shaped culture writ large. And finally, we'll turn our attentions to Biden's win and what that might mean for the art world, both in terms of government funding for the arts, as well as for the market. First, I'd like to look at Trump's tax cuts and his tax policies overall, a somewhat dry topic, but an important one, especially because Trump's tax cuts, which came into effect in 2018, particularly benefited corporations and wealthy individuals. They also eviscerated the estate tax, which is the tax on someone's private property upon their death, and raised the exemption to $11 million for individuals or up to $22 million for married couples. And these effects continue through 2025. Whereas in the past, the tax code would have encouraged individuals to donate works of art to museums in order to lessen their tax burden, the current policy disincentivizes such behavior. And in fact, as you can see in this graph here, which was sourced from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, the share of Trump's tax cuts going to the richest 1% is incredibly high at 67.4%. Of course, this is the same group that largely constitutes art collectors. Whereas Trump's tax cuts were perceived as a net positive for the art market, given that they benefited the wealthiest Americans, Trump also eliminated popular tax breaks among art market participants. One of these was called 1031 like-kind exchanges. These were created initially for the real estate market, with the idea that you could sell one property and purchase another similar asset without having to pay tax. So an example of this in the art market was that one could, say, sell a work by Andy Warhol and then use the proceeds from that sale to buy another work, say by Ed Ruscha, and as long as that new work was of similar or greater value, one wouldn't have to pay tax. And this is especially important in the art market because art has a very high capital gains tax rate at 28%. Trump also limited the amount of state and local taxes that could be deducted from one's federal tax bill. And so this particularly impacted high earners in high tax states like New York, who found that their tax bill increased as a result. Trump's trade wars had unintended consequences for the art trade. So, for instance, his trade wars with China led to a 7.5% tax being levied on sculpture, engravings, prints, collages, and antiques being imported from China into the US. Even more unusual was the 25% tax increase on contemporary photographs, prints, and lithographs imported from the UK and Germany that was introduced as part of a civil aviation trade dispute with the European Union. In terms of government's funding for the arts, the Trump administration tried to completely strip funding from federal agencies, such as the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. These federal agencies support arts initiatives, research and education in the humanities, and library museum services, among other things. The US already has relatively low levels of public support for the arts, and these proposed cuts would have only compounded that issue. For instance, the most recent budget, introduced in February 2020, called for, and I quote here, stopping wasteful and unnecessary spending. It stated that, quote, activities funded by the NEA, NEH are not considered core federal responsibilities. And in this document, you can find the Trump administration's rationalization for eliminating the NEA entirely. And I quote here, the administration believes audiences and aficionados are better than the government at deciding what art is good or important. While Trump's policies were certainly impactful, more significant for the art world, perhaps, were the effects of Trumpism. After Trump's election in 2016, one could argue that the left felt extremely disempowered, unable to effect meaningful political change. And so, with political power blocked, the left retreated to the domains in which they were able to exert more influence, such as media and culture. This led to an incredible amount of anti-Trump art, but also art world mobilization. Under Trump, culture became a means of correcting political wrongs and took on a highly symbolic form. This was evident in the purging of Confederate statues, the examination of individuals on the boards of museums, in the Me Too reckoning, and in calls for racial justice. Art world activists took on so-called toxic philanthropy, with protests encouraging museums to cut ties with the Sackler family based on their role in the opioid crisis in the United States, and against Warren Kanders, vice chairman of the Whitney Museum, for his ownership of a company that manufactures tear gas. Decolonize This Place, a post-Occupy Wall Street movement, organized weekly protests at the Whitney Museum, even deeming the Whitney Biennial the tear gas biennial. Following months of protests, Warren Kanders did ultimately resign in 2019. And in 2020, Black Lives Matter protests led to a racial reckoning that has reverberated throughout cultural institutions. In June, an Instagram account called Change the Museum began publishing accounts of racism from employees at major museums, including New York's Museum of Modern Art, as well as the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Staffers at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Akron Art Museum, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and the Guggenheim Museum, among others, published open letters decrying what they described as cultures of racism at their institutions. Calls for racial justice had an effect on the commercial art world as well. The gallerist David Zwirner, for instance, hired curator Ebony Haynes to helm a new gallery space in New York with an all-Black staff. This was a real first in terms of the commercial art world and its commitment to diversity. In contrast to the Trump administration, Joe Biden seems to have a very different track record and approach when it comes to art. During his long tenure as US Senator, he consistently supported the National Endowment for the Arts. He also co-sponsored legislation to establish the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. As vice president, he also is credited with helping to negotiate the 2009 stimulus bill in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis that included $50 million for the arts that many institutions viewed as critical. And in fact, this additional $50 million was a sort of handwritten addition at the last minute that Biden is said to have negotiated with Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. And indeed, in an interview from August, he said, "The future of who we are lies in the arts. It is the expression of our soul." After his victory, Biden posted a video inspired by the artist Lorraine O'Grady's series, Art Is, from 1983 and 2009. In 1983, O'Grady took to the streets of Harlem with an ornate gold frame for New York's African American Day Parade. And the Biden campaign's video reprises a similar gold frame to capture citizens across America. The campaign reached out to O'Grady's gallery in New York, Alexander Gray Associates, to obtain the artist's permission before making the video. In addition, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris is also known for her support of the arts. She was a vocal opponent of the Trump administration's attempts to eliminate NEA and NEH funding and stressed the importance of art on her social media platforms. While she was district attorney of San Francisco before becoming a US Senator, she served on the board of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. She also has talked about the fact that her late uncle worked for the Studio Museum in Harlem, and her stepdaughter is studying art at Parsons in New York. She also co-sponsored the Confederate Monument Removal Act in 2019, along with other senators. She also supported the National Museum of the American Latino Act, sponsored by Senator Robert Menendez, as well as the creation of a comprehensive women's history museum within the Smithsonian Institution. To conclude this first section, which examines the political environment in the United States, I'd like to take a minute just to discuss the future outlook. So many believe that Biden's win, in combination with the likelihood of a Republican-controlled Senate, as well as the possibility of a COVID vaccine, could present a real boon for Wall Street. And if this does prove to be the case, this would likely have a positive effect on the art market. But if the Republicans do maintain control of the Senate, and that is yet to be confirmed, it's contingent on a runoff election in the state of Georgia in January, that would mean that efforts to address wealth inequality in the United States or to reverse the Trump tax cuts would in fact be very difficult to enact. And so those tax cuts, which effectively have resulted in a 2.6% tax decrease for the wealthiest Americans, would remain in place. And while that may have adverse effects for society as a whole, that may continue to boost art market performance. So for the second half of this presentation, I now want to turn our attention to the COVID-19 pandemic and the way in which it's impacting the art market in the United States. But first, I'd like to cover our agenda to give you an overview of the topics that I'll be covering in the second half of my presentation. First, I'll be addressing how the pandemic has affected the US economy and that of the art world, how institutions have pivoted as a result of these circumstances, and I'll be specifically looking at galleries, art fairs, museums, and auction houses. And finally, I'll be looking at how these developments are connected to trends that were already evident even prior to the pandemic. As you can see from this graph here, which is based on data from Johns Hopkins University, the US has so far been unsuccessful in containing the coronavirus epidemic. Each gray bar represents the number of new cases reported each day. And if this bar carried on into the present, you would see that the average number of cases has only increased since November 3rd. As a result, unemployment has been especially high. As you can see from this graph here, unemployment rates reached 13.3% in early 2020, which was higher than even the highest levels of the 2008 so-called Great Recession. The effects on the arts specifically have been great. An April survey by the nonprofit Americans for the Arts revealed that 62% of the 11,000 respondents had become fully unemployed because of COVID-19, and 95% had experienced income loss. After Artist Relief opened applications for a $5,000 emergency relief grant, it received over 55,000 applications for only 200 spots within the first 15 days. And not just individuals, but institutions are in crisis. Galleries have seen a loss in revenue. A survey by the Art Dealers Association of America from earlier this year projected a 73% loss in revenue for the second fiscal quarter, and also documented a 74% decrease in employment for contractors and freelancers employed by galleries. Museums, as we will see in just a moment, are also in crisis. And this is especially true in New York. Not only was New York City one of the most severely affected cities in the United States by COVID-19, but also the pandemic came on top of pre-existing pressures that had been building in the city as our businesses, artists, and others struggled to keep up with the rising costs of operations. And yet, many perceive the US art economy as being particularly resilient. The US has by far the largest number of high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals in the world, as well as a stronger and more developed upper middle class than many emerging regions. And New York City in particular is home to the most millionaires and billionaires of any city in the world, as well as being still the most important art capital globally. This resilience may only be further supported by the wealth increases that the wealthiest Americans have experienced during this time. So this image from the Institute for Policy Studies shows that during the early weeks of the pandemic in the United States between March 18th and June 11th, 2020, the number of unemployed individuals reached 44.1 million, and yet US billionaires experienced a 21.5% increase in their wealth. The increase in the share of wealth held by the richest Americans may very well have a positive effect on the art market. That's reflected in the image that we see here, which was taken from a 2015 report by Citi and shows the trajectory of top auction prices between 2000 and 2014 as a reflection of widening inequality, particularly at the highest reaches of the market. It seems likely that barring significant political change, that inequality will only increase as a result of the pandemic. This image that you see here from the International Monetary Fund shows, using data from 1961 to 2017, that pandemic effects worldwide have tended to increase inequality as measured by the net Gini coefficient. There have been some efforts by the US federal government to assist distressed arts organizations and businesses, though these efforts are quite limited, especially relative to the US's European counterparts, such as Germany. The government did provide $75 million to the National Endowment for the Arts, and also through its Paycheck Protection Program, provided loans for galleries. So for instance, mega galleries, including Pace, Gagosian, Hauser & Wirth, and David Zwirner, all received loans between $2 million and $5 million. But based on their self-reporting, David Zwirner said that it retained no jobs as a result of this support, whereas Pace reported retaining 80 jobs and Gagosian retained 203 jobs. This meant that these galleries were in the top 1% of loan recipients, as only 1% of loans were over $1.5 million. In contrast, other smaller galleries received smaller loan amounts. So for instance, Chelsea galleries, galleries based in the Chelsea neighborhood in New York, like Jack Shaman, Casman, Gladstone, Listen, Lorraine Augustine, etc., received somewhere between $350,000 to $1 million in loans. And other galleries received $150,000 to $350,000 in loans. Yet smaller galleries received as much as a reported $6,000, and others were deemed ineligible because either they had no employees or only sporadic revenue. Beyond government support, what were galleries to do? They were facing lockdowns, limited attendance figures, and the loss of art fairs and art fair revenue. So many did what they could do, which was to move their activities online and in some cases launch online viewing rooms or OVRs. And here's one example. This is a viewing room on Marion Goodman Gallery's website, a show that they currently have up of Robert Smithson works. And one thing that you'll notice is that the online viewing rooms often do maintain the sort of basic structures and aesthetics of exhibitions, mirroring the kind of white cube environment that you would expect to see in the physical space, also showing the works framed as if on view. And you'll also see, though, one departure is greater price transparency. Some have said that there was more transparency, perhaps towards the beginning of the pandemic, but for the first time, collectors or browsers can see prices without having to request that information from the gallery directly. The success of these online viewing rooms has perhaps been somewhat varied. According to a recent survey of 1,000 established New York collectors, this is from the New York Art Market Report that was recently produced by Independent Art Fair and Claire McAndrew. The survey found that 47% of these known collectors acquired at least one work of art from a gallery website or through emails with dealers in the past year, and 32% had made acquisitions through galleries' online viewing rooms. At the same time, more than 25% of these known collectors had yet to make an online art purchase. Another strategy has been a renewed focus on the local market, on local activities, local in-person exhibitions, and in fact, local collectors. This is in part due to the loss of opportunities like art fairs. So here you can see in this graph, which represents the share of dealers' sales that came from art fairs between 2010 and 2017, you can see that by 2017, some 46% of overall sales were taking place at art fairs, and 30% were from overseas fairs. So clearly there had been an increasing focus on the global market. And now, faced with the pandemic, galleries are reverting to a more local approach. This brings us to our next institution, which is the art fair itself. Art fairs multiplied around the world from about 55 in 2000 to at least 180 in 2014. And you can see that even individual galleries increased the number of art fairs they attended considerably. So if we look at this image, we see that just the number of fairs that the David Zwirner Gallery attended between 2006 and 2015 had increased fourfold, from 5 fairs back in 2006 to 20 in 2014, which required considerable gallery resources. But it seems that the pandemic is only exacerbating some pre-existing trends within the art fair space. We were already seeing some consolidation around the biggest fairs. Smaller fairs, more niche fairs, had been struggling already in prior years as galleries and collectors alike were experiencing what has been called art fair fatigue. There are also already disparities in terms of art fair participation according to the size of the gallery. So for instance, mega galleries were able to invest considerably in large, centrally located booths, as they were able to easily recoup that investment in terms of sales, especially given the high price points at which they were selling. Smaller galleries were finding art fairs a much more significant financial risk. Though their booth fees were smaller, they also were selling at a much lower price point, making it difficult to recoup their investment. In response to this, in 2019, the Art Basel Fair in Basel introduced a new policy where smaller galleries paid 8% less for their booth, whereas larger ones paid 9% more. And in fact, newcomers to the fair received an additional 20% discount off of their square meter price. However, we could anticipate that with the pandemic, the fact that smaller galleries already are experiencing disadvantages, that this trend is only likely to further increase. And so smaller galleries that have had smaller staffs may not have been eligible for government loans. They also may not have had the resources to move their activities online to the same extent. They may not have had the technological know-how or the ability to outsource the building of online viewing rooms. This kind of disparity between the largest and most profitable galleries and those that tend to be small or mid-sized may very well become even more pronounced in the years ahead, which also leads to the question about the survival of art fairs themselves. Art fairs have also introduced their own online viewing rooms as a way of engaging their clients, effectively the galleries, until they can resume their normal in-person activities. But yet many smaller fairs are also not charging these galleries for participation. It's only the biggest brand name galleries that seem to be able to ask for a fee for this service. And so if these smaller galleries are unable to get that sort of rental income, that booth income that they would typically get from a fair, what is the likelihood that they'll be able to survive until art fairs are able to resume in person, which some project could be not until late 2021. This is an example of one art fair online viewing room, Freezes. And in fact, for their October edition, they charged galleries between $2,000 and $7,600 for participating in their online viewing rooms, depending on their location on the site. Another thing art fairs are doing to drive traffic to their websites and to maintain their relevance even at this moment is to do more online programming and events. And so here you see a screenshot of events that were being offered on Friday, December 4th for their Art Basel Miami Beach Fair, which though held virtually through online viewing rooms, was still hosting a range of programming, including fair walkthroughs, artist talks, and panel discussions. And yet you can see, even in comparison to the gallery activities, the art fair OVRs have been, at least according to some studies, less successful. So this is from the New York Art Market report that was released in November 2020. And you can see that according to this survey of collectors, art fair OVRs were only used for purchases by 22% of the polled collectors, in comparison to 32% for the gallery online viewing rooms. And that percentage was even less than online auctions, as well as just direct communication with the gallery through email or through the gallery website. So now I want to turn to another art world institution, museums, which has faced their own set of unique challenges as a result of the pandemic. According to a survey that was released in November 2020 by the American Alliance of Museums, nearly 1 out of 3, 1/3 of museum directors said that their institutions were at risk of permanent closure if they did not find additional funding in the next 12 months. 12% of museum directors characterized their institution as being at significant risk, and 17% said they, quote, didn't know if they would be able to survive. So all in all, a fairly dire picture, and one exacerbated by the fact that museums in the United States have a different funding model than many European institutions. American museums are much more reliant on private philanthropy in combination with ticket sales and other kinds of in-person oriented revenue streams. So for instance, revenue from their museum shops, from their retail arms, from restaurants and bars. which makes them particularly vulnerable at this moment. The reliance on private philanthropy has also been a particular challenge. So American museums have moved their annual fundraising galas online, these events that typically attract high-level donors, but have found that these virtual events are not as effective. They found that these events only brought in about 2/3 of expected donations, and that was based on projections or fundraising goals that were determined prior to the pandemic. In response to this unfolding crisis, the Association of Art Museum Directors relaxed their guidelines. So one rule effectively that they have in place for members is that members can only deaccession artworks from their collection or sell works from their collection in order to finance new acquisitions. But now, under these new guidelines, museums have an opportunity to sell existing works not only for new acquisitions, but also for the ongoing care of their collections. Kind of acknowledgement of just how serious this situation has become for American museums. So in October, the Brooklyn Museum sold old master works at Christie's and works by Dubuffet, Monet, Degas, Miro, and Matisse at Sotheby's. And this is a screenshot from the Sotheby's website that shows the auction house publicizing its sale of property from the Brooklyn Museum. A website says explicitly sold to support museum collections. So now we turn our attention to the final art institution that we'll be looking at today, which is auction houses. Auction houses in many ways can be seen as having a very conservative business model. They still rely on in-person sales, lavishly produced printed catalogs to publicize those sales, and prior to those sales, global tours of artwork so that collectors can see those objects in person. And yet, with the pandemic, we've seen many auction houses very quickly innovate and modernize the way that they do business. Christie's and Sotheby's, of course, being the largest auction houses, also have the most resources to introduce new approaches and not only had the technology in place to hold sales online, but have also innovated in terms of their platform and the features that they're able to offer. Meanwhile, smaller players have also had to move their activities online, but have sometimes relied on companies like Invaluable. Invaluable is a Boston-based secondary market platform, which allows auction houses to hold sales via their site. And within the first few months of the pandemic, they had seen a 70% increase in new auction houses signing up for their services. In comparison, the biggest auction houses have turned their sales into spectacles that rely on their technological prowess and also are multifaceted events and featuring talks and panels in order to drive attendance to their sites. So for instance, in October, Sotheby's held a sale that saw nearly 1 million viewers, a combination of online attendees as well as those tuning in through Museum TV and the financial news network Cheddar TV. And you can see one such sale here at Sotheby's, the auctioneer Oliver Barker taking bids from his colleagues around the world. So auction houses are a good example of how the pandemic is accelerating trends that were already underway. One being the move online. Auction houses had already identified holding online sales as cost effective. Also, they were seeing increasing interest in online-only sales as well as online bidding from younger collectors. But another such pre-existing trend that has only increased with the pandemic is the auction houses' shift to luxury. Already in 2019, Sotheby's had demonstrated its commitment to the luxury market and increasing its presence in that space. Following Patrick Drahi's acquisition of the auction house for $3.7 billion. After his acquisition, he appointed Charles Stewart as CEO, who restructured Sotheby's into two, quote unquote, equally important global divisions. Those were fine art, but the second was luxury art and objects. The fact that luxury art and objects received equal billing to fine art was revealing. Stewart declared that luxury creates the possibility, and I quote him here, to further develop new sales channels, including marketplaces, e-commerce, and even retail, putting us on a path for future growth. And in fact, the pandemic has only accelerated what was already happening in that space as well. It's clear that some collecting categories translate better into an online sale than others. And online only sales within these luxury categories had already been proven to be effective. And so Sotheby's ramped up their luxury sales offerings this year, holding 160 luxury sales versus 48 in 2019. And also these sales were quite successful in terms of their high sell-through rates. They also expanded their luxury offerings, holding sales of collectibles like high-end sneakers and items by Supreme. And also held in October of this year a sale in collaboration with Prada on the occasion of their first runway show with the designer Raf Simons. And in that sale, they not only sold garments from the collection, but items from the runway show itself, ephemera like invitations to the fashion show. So to conclude this section of my presentation, I'd like to briefly look at the outlook for both the nonprofit and the for-profit sectors. But first, the nonprofit sector. So one thing that the pandemic is certainly doing is revealing the weaknesses inherent to institutions. And this is true across the board, but particularly you see this in terms of museums in the United States. So the so-called American model is reliant not on government funds, but on private philanthropy. But there are obviously risks with this kind of approach. And you see at the moment the drop in private philanthropy coupled with the loss of income from museum attendance, as well as from retail and other kinds of experiential revenue streams, has created a real crisis. So even though museums have taken on a diverse range of activities, encompassing everything from hosting corporate events to managing bars and restaurants, to organizing in-person programming like music events and talks and so on. All of these diverse activities have been put on hold for the foreseeable future as a result of the pandemic. And thus, there seems to be great vulnerabilities to this model. And similarly, the outlook for the commercial sector also reflects some pressure points that had already been identified within the market in the United States, but are becoming even more pronounced as the result of current circumstances. So again, we're seeing the exacerbation of ongoing pre-existing trends. So the polarization and consolidation of market share at the very top. So even though those mega galleries received government support and furloughed staff, they still seem in a much stronger position to not only survive, but to thrive in the aftermath of the pandemic. It's also accelerating the shift to online activity. However, it's worth noting that this online activity is still basically replicating the existing structures of the art market. So galleries, online viewing rooms are not proposing an alternative way of doing business, but basically taking those exhibitions, the way that they communicate with collectors, and just moving it online. The same can be said for art fairs, which again are sort of organized by gallery, which effectively may not have a booth, but has a kind of virtual space that's dedicated to that particular gallery and its artists. Or auction houses, which already, even before the pandemic, were airing their sales through their websites. So this is perhaps a more sophisticated version of that, but it's not upending the business models that have been in existence for centuries. So the question does remain, though, that as the art market moves increasingly online, whether there will be truly innovative or even disruptive models that will challenge, subvert, even replace some of these pre-existing models. And as of yet, we have not seen this, although I think it could be on the horizon. We're also seeing a greater porousness to other creative fields like fashion and design. And already, even prior to the pandemic, we saw Hollywood agencies opening fine arts divisions to represent artists in their pursuits beyond the art world. And certainly there are a lot of opportunities that exist for artists in this direction to collaborate with brands, to design products. And I think this is something that is also likely to increase in the months and years ahead. And finally, there remains a very interesting question. What role will art play going forward? In particular, when we think of contemporary art, it seems that the public is more cognizant of and interested in art of living artists than ever before. And the commercial sector has tried to capitalize on this. You see mega galleries opening up museum-sized spaces. So for instance, Pace's new bespoke building in Chelsea is larger in terms of its square footage than the new museum in New York. You see Hauser and Wirth during the pandemic opening a new bespoke building designed by Annabelle Seldorf that also prioritizes spaces that will ultimately be used for public programming, retail, and hospitality. These moves betray an awareness that value is generated less and less by elites and connoisseurs and more by a kind of public consensus, perhaps amplified by social media. And yet, at the moment, the public is limited in terms of its access to arts institutions and in-person art viewing in general. So I'd like to end on this optimistic note that while the art world is forced to evolve rapidly as institutions shift their activities into virtual spaces and brick and mortar spaces and in-person events become less important, that new ideas and new ways of doing things and new approaches might be germinating, and that these ultimately may engage a broader public and create a more equitable art world. And on that note, I'd like to thank you again for your consideration and attention.